Coming up, Austerity 1.0 was imposed by the then Chancellor George Osborne during David Cameron's Tory Lib Dem coalition known as the ConDem government. It meant deep cuts to community services like libraries and social care, as well as to the justice system, the prison service, road maintenance, policing and defence. Austerity 1.0 then stripped away much of the UK's social fabric, causing lasting and profound economic damage still in evidence today. It's not all Brexit, it has to be said. Even more tragically, a recent study claimed that Cameron and Osborne's austerity policy was responsible for hundreds of thousands of excess deaths. Austerity 1.0 intended that 3/4 of the gap between spending and taxation was to be filled by spending cuts. With the exception of the National Health Service, schools and aid spending, all other government budgets were slashed. Public sector pay was frozen and the tax burden rose, mainly through the regressive tax VAT. Austerity 1.0 didn't actually work, it didn't balance the books, and it led to reduced life expectancy and a lower standard of living for everyone bar the billionaires. So why the hell are we about to be shafted again by Austerity 2.0? It's the exact opposite of what I believe should happen. Stay tuned. If you enjoy watching the Truth to Power channel, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me out by hitting the like button and especially by sharing a link to this video on your social media platforms. There's a huge wave of industrial action taking place across the UK this winter. Railways, postal services, law courts, nursing and rubbish collection are just some of the many public services that are grinding to a halt. For old gits like me, it's bringing back childhood memories of the Edward Heath Tory government of the early 70s with blackouts, 3-day weeks, and many families not having enough money to feed the kids and heat their home, as costs were rising far quicker than wages. Does that all sound familiar? Because the rising cost of living again appears to be the major cause of discontent in 2022, with inflation in double figures after many sectors have suffered years and years of real-term pay cuts. Ever since those Cameron-Osborne years, in other words, under successive Tory governments, Britain has been beset by weak economic growth, anemic productivity, and stagnant private and public sector investment. The first 5 years of Austerity 1.0, from 2010 to 2015, were to no avail. As the Office for Budget Responsibility subsequently commented, the persistent underperformance of productivity and real GDP over that period meant the deficit remained higher than initially expected. A 2015 study found that UK productivity as measured by GDP per hour worked was lower than in the rest of the G7 group of nations by a whopping 18 percentage points. Austerity 1.0 failed on its own measure, and Osborne chose to extend Austerity 1.0, let's call it Austerity 1.1, beyond 2015 to try to tackle the remaining fiscal deficit. Now, most economists would say that the fiscal belt-tightening sucked demand out of the UK economy and made Britain's productivity even worse by stifling investment. And then along came 2016. Remember what happened in 2016? I'll give you a clue. They won Get Over It. And if we don't like it, we can go and bloody live in the EU. The reasons for the Leave vote are many and varied, not just about immigration, of course. Austerity 1.0 and the years of underinvestment in poorer parts of the UK must have had a part to play in what was basically a protest vote, a signal of dissatisfaction with the status quo. Since that advisory referendum, our political leadership has been in a state of Brexit-induced panic as the Brexit experiment's failure becomes ever more obvious. And we head back to the old days of Britain being the so-called sick man of Europe. Okay, despite moving down the league table, we're still the 6th largest economy in the world, one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. Yet food bank use in this country is 35% above its pre-pandemic level, while at the same time we have more billionaires in Britain than ever before. And that trend appears to be here to stay under the economic stewardship of Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt. As I record this, we're 1 week away from Hunt's announcement of his fiscal statement, but, as is the Tory way, they covertly provide selected details to journalists and some of the public as a form of kite flying to measure the electorate's likely response to some of these strange policies. This practice is obviously a contempt of parliamentary democracy, and although Speaker Lindsay Hoyle regularly moans about it, he does sod all to stop it. These so-called leaks suggest that the gap between taxation and spending are going to be filled half by tax rises and half by further public spending cuts. I've heard no talk of asking Dido Harding where the hell that £37 billion of test and trace money went, and there's no sign of Rishi Sunak chasing up the estimated £33 billion lost due to fraudulent COVID claims and contracts, and no indication of ending the non-dom status enjoyed by 1 in 5 executives in the City of London, which it said would raise another £3.2 billion annually in tax revenue. Instead, spending and welfare cuts are coming, and general taxation is also going to rise. UK productivity growth since the global financial crisis of 2008 has continued to trail the rest of the G7 group of nations, with the US, France and Germany leaving us trailing in their wake. People's median incomes in the UK are also lagging behind the major EU countries over the same period, and we've recently even been overtaken by Poland, for example. We've forecast that the average Slovenian family will be better off than their British equivalents by the end of next year. And according to the OECD, among the G20 group of the world's largest economies, only sanctions hit Russia is forecast to have worse economic growth next year. And some economic forecasters are now warning that the UK may have to be bailed out by the International Monetary Fund unless underlying economic problems like productivity can be addressed. The causes of our current dire economic situation started with the global financial crash of 2008 for sure, but those effects were guaranteed and cemented by Austerity 1.0 in the years leading up to the Brexit vote. Then, the Leave vote itself undermined international confidence in the UK economy as it destabilised our relationship with the largest trading bloc in the world on our doorstep. But underlying all of that is Britain's unbalanced economy, which, after Margaret Thatcher's destruction of the UK's manufacturing base, has been heavily reliant upon the services sector, and which has been becalmed by low productivity because of 1. Years of underinvestment in infrastructure and capital assets, and 2, because of the Tory wet dream of a gig economy, which delivers low unemployment, but often in insecure and low-paid work, with employers effectively being subsidised from the public purse through their workers having to have their paltry take-home earnings topped up by welfare benefits. Most benefit claimants in the UK today are actually in work, and the gig economy, this deregulated Tory labour market, is a big reason why. Sunak and Hunt's forthcoming Austerity 2.0 is likely to deliver more of the same in an effort to plug the nation's finances. Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove recently said that although ideally you wouldn't want to reduce long-term capital investments, he was sure some spending on big projects will be cut. Meanwhile, the non-partisan Institute for Fiscal Studies has pronounced that the solution to the budget deficit should not be Austerity 2.0, but instead they say that it's increasing investment, having more of a focus on the long term. It's having economic strategies that you set out and actually commit to over time. As far as possible, it's creating more certainty over economic policy. And then the Centre for European Reform is in agreement, saying, we have a real problem in the sense that the only way to really durably raise productivity growth for this country is for investments to pick up. Both the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Centre for European Reform understand that while Austerity 1.0 came on the back of a period of sustained growth, strong economic performance and a well-funded public sector under successive Labour governments, Austerity 2.0 comes after a decade of Tory underinvestment in public services and the COVID-19 pandemic, from which the economy has not yet recovered, and the economic damage caused by Brexit. Its effects will be far more damaging even than the original austerity. The tragedy is that austerity was and remains a political choice. There is an alternative, as set out by the IFS and the Centre for European Reform, that revolves around investment and long-term economic strategies to improve productivity. The so-called black hole in the public finances is really just an accounting device, not a real loss of money. Much of the national debt is money owed by the UK government to itself, and it's therefore meaningless to talk about repaying the national debt. As Richard Murphy, Professor of Accounting Practice at Sheffield University, points out in his excellent free-to-download book, Money for Nothing, those promoting debt repayment do so to stop us thinking about what the state can really do for us. Professor Murphy's saying, basically in the book, that austerity is very much a political choice, basically a policy decision. He suggests that if it cared, if it wanted to, that the state could reduce wealth inequality, it could consider a universal basic income. It could also deliver a Green New Deal with investments in green technology and the creation of new jobs in new green industries. But instead, we get Austerity 2.0 from the same politicians who promote debt repayment as an alternative to long-term investment strategies that would actually benefit most people in this country. Another quote from Professor Murphy. The national debt is really no such thing. It's actually savings and money. The real job is to spend those sums wisely. Austerity 2.0 is not what I would call spending those sums wisely. The core functions of a modern state have already been cut to the bone by Austerity 1.0. The NHS and social care system is on the brink of collapse. The justice system is creaking. School buildings are dilapidated. And even simple things like mending potholes, running public libraries, local police stations and weekly bin collections have all become a thing of the past for many of us. And yet, Sunak and Hunt are said to be looking at 50% of the deficit reduction being achieved through further public spending cuts, perhaps delayed until after the next election so the next government carries the can for the pain. It's all trickery and nonsense. Austerity is a choice, not an economic necessity. By increasing the tax burden on those best able to afford it, or by ditching these meaningless debt targets altogether, then we'd be able to not only properly fund public services, but also begin to reverse the damage caused by 12 years of Tory cuts, economic mismanagement, and the movement of wealth from the very poorest to the very richest in our society.